In this project, we're going to look at how to front-end a database, in particular a SQLite database. SQLite is simply a great way of creating a local database file that can be accessed through C#, and to access that, we're going to use a couple Nuget packages to extend C#. We're going to use the SQLite.Core Nuget and a Nuget called Dapper that allows us to create a connection string a little bit easier than the traditional ways of using ADO.NET or Entity Framework. So we're going to create a connection to the database file. We'll actually store the database file in the same folder as our executable. We're going to read the data into a list and then query that list using Microsoft Link to pull out the years and find just the unique years in that list. The database is going to have about a little over 11,000 records. And so for each year there are numerous records because this includes all the nominations for all the categories for each year. What we want to be able to do is then in this list box that's populated by our link is to select a year and see all the categories for that particular year because the categories change from year to year. So I'm going to click the Best Picture category, and in 2011 then, this list box is populated using another link, and that link simply shows all of the films that were nominated for Best Picture, and then we could click on this button which will show us what the winner was. So that's our project. Let's go ahead and jump into Visual Studio. Before we go to Visual Studio, we need to grab a couple files off our Canvas course site. So log into the Canvas course site, go to the modules area. In the module area, you're going to scroll down to Unit 19. And there's the Oscars database file that I've already created for you, and I'll show you how to do that in the previous video. We're going to get that file, and then we're also going to get the Oscar statue PNG transparent background file. So let's get the database file. I'm just going to click on it and then choose Download Oscars Database, or DB. So SQLite generally uses a .db file extension. Sometimes you'll also see SQLite as the extension. And I'm going to go back and get that statue. And both of those should be going into my downloads folder. All right, now we're ready to jump into Visual Studio. So here I am in Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new project. It's going to be a Windows Desktop, Windows Forms app project. And I'm naming it C11 Oscars Project. In parentheses, I put Frontending SQLite. By the way, SQLite is spelled with only one L, so it's almost really SQLite, but we generally refer to it as SQLite. I'm going to click OK. Noticing where my project is being stored. I'm going to get this Windows form. I'm going to make my form a little bit bigger, and we can always shrink it back down later. I'm going to change the text to simply be C11 Oscars Project. Press Enter, and there it is on our title bar. Now I'm going to go into Windows Explorer, go into my Downloads folder. Here are my two files that we downloaded from Canvas. I'm going to select both of those and just simply choose Copy. And I like to keep my files with my project. So then I'm going to go find my project. And here's my project. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to go into the first folder where we have our Form 1 files. And I'm going to paste. So I've got both the Oscars DB and the Oscar statue. Now those are stored in our project folder. They're not yet part of our project. We're going to have to import those into our project to use those. So back in Visual Studio, I'm going to right click on my project in the Solution Explorer and choose Add. I'm going to add an existing item. And because DB is not part of the data files or part of these other files, I'm just going to choose all files. Find my Oscar.db file and click add. And then I'm going to select it in the list. I'm going to change the build action to be content and change the copy to output directory to be copy if newer. So right now this project is in my, so right now this database file is in my project. By doing the copy if newer, that's going to put it into our debug folder, our bin debug folder, along with the executable. And if changes are made to that database file, it will always copy the newer file into that debug folder. Just to demonstrate that, I'm going to open up my project folder again. If I go into bin debug, you notice the folder is empty. I'm going to go to Visual Studio and just simply start my compiler. And we get our project. Of course, it doesn't do anything at the moment. I'm just going to close it. I'm going to go back into the debug folder, and you'll see that now we have our executable, some of the support files, but here is our oscars.db. It was copied from that project folder into our bin debug folder. To use the SQL database file, we need to extend C# by adding in some Nuget packages. And to do that, I'm in the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right click on the solution, come down to Manage Nuget Packages. And in the Nuget Package Manager, I'm going to browse, hit the Browse tab, and I'm going to search for SQLite. There's a bunch of things here. The one we want is the system.data SQLite.Core. I'm going to select that and choose Install over here on the right. It's going to verify that I want to install it. That now will give us access to the SQLite database and to be able to send SQL commands to that SQLite database. And then I'm going to look for another Nuget package called Dapper. And Dapper is this one here by Sam Saffron and Mark Gravel and Nick Craver. So I'm going to select that and install it. Again, I'm going to select OK. And the Dapper is going to allow us to do a connection to that database file in a much easier way than if we use the traditional ADO.NET or Entity Framework. Once those are installed, you can close the Nuget Package Manager. And we're then ready to create our model class for our data. Our SQLite database Oscars.db was originally created using DB Browser and importing an Excel spreadsheet. And so here's the Excel spreadsheet, and you can see the different fields for our database file. We had an ID field, and that ID field is an auto-incremented integer. We have a year, which is an integer. And then the category, winner, and entity are strings. So that's going to become our model for our project. So in Visual Studio, I'm going to right-click on my project and choose Add Class. And I'm going to call this class nominee.cs. In our class, we're going to set up the properties. The first one's going to be a public int. We're going to call it ID, and we're going to use get and set methods. Then we'll have public int year, also with get and set. Public string, this is going to be our category. We have public winner, which is also going to be a string, even though it's true, false, and is a Boolean value, or could be a Boolean value. Coming from our database file, our Oscars.db, it is referenced as a text category there. So we're going to keep it a string. And of course, get and set. And then finally, we have another string value, which is entity, and we're also going to get and set it. So there is our class nominee. I don't need to create a constructor in this case, and I'm not going to have any methods. This is just going to be to store our data. I can close that file, and I'm going to save the changes. So we have our nominee CS file over here in our Solution Explorer. And now we're going to create another class. This is going to be for our helper methods in connecting to our DB database. So once again, I'm going to choose Add for our project, create a new class. And we're going to call this one SQLite Data Access. It should be a class, and I'm going to say Add. We'll come back and work on this in a little bit. In our project, we also have an app config file. So I'm going to go to app config. We need to create a connection string for our database file. So here under configuration, we're going to add connection string tag. That needs to be plural. And then inside those tags, we're going to do an add tag. We're going to give our connection string a name. I'm simply going to call it CIS262AD. We could have named it anything we wanted. I got an extra D in there. I'm going to get rid of CIS262AD. That's going to be the name. Then we're going to set up a connection string. So we'll reference this connection string via the name of CIS262AD. But our connection string is going to be data source equals, and I want to capitalize the D of data source. I'm going to do a dot backslash, which is going to reference the same directory that our executable is going to be in, and then I need to tell it which file I want. So Oscars.db. A semicolon, and I'm going to tell it this is version 3. So that is our connection string. One more parameter or one more argument I need here is the provider name. And the provider name in this case is going to be system.data.sql client. We have the closing tag of our add tag. And I'm going to close my app config, saving my changes. In the SQLite Data Access class file, I need to add some directives to connect with those Nuget packages that we downloaded earlier. So I'm going to add in a using Dapper, using system.configuration. Now that is not tied to the Nuget package, but it's an API that we're going to need to use, along with system.data. And then finally our SQLite.Core, it's going to be referenced by system.data.SQLite. Okay, so those are our four directives. Notice they're kind of grayed out. This is because they're not being referenced at the moment. And as we add code that references items in these directives, they will no longer be grayed out. So we have our class SQLite data access. I'm going to add a method here, and to save you the boredom of watching me type, I've already created the method. I'm simply going to copy and paste, and I'll walk you through the method. So this is going to return a list of type nominee. That was our model class, and we're just going to call this load nominees. What this is going to do is it's going to make our connection to our database file, and it's going to read in all that data into a list of type nominee. So we want to connect to that database file, and we're going to use our connection string name of CIS262AD. So I just set a variable name of my ID, and then we're going to use a using block. Now I don't think we've seen this previously, but what this does is the using block allows us to take a managed type that accesses unmanaged resources. In this case, it's going to be a file handle to our database file. And by wrapping it in this using block, IDB connection here is an object, and we're going to ensure that that connection closes when it's all done, because in order to use using, this object has to be of idisposable interface. And by wrapping it in the using block, then it will call the dispose method to get rid of it when we're done. Let's just make sure that our file gets closed. So in the using, I've got this IDB connection that I'm naming con, C-O-N-N. That's pretty standard for our connection string. It's going to equal a new SQLite connection. This is coming from our system.data SQLite. And I'm going to call a method called load connection string and pass it my ID. And we're getting a squiggly because we haven't created that method yet. That's coming up here shortly. And then we're going to query the database. We're going to send con a query of type nominee, and we're going to send it a SQL string of select star from nominees. And nominees is the table of Oscars.db that we want to use. And they're going to send it some dynamic parameters that are basically going to be null at this point. We're going to return the output, converting it to list. It's going to go into a list of type nominee. Okay, so that's our first method. Now I need the load connection string method. And here's our load connection string method. My squiggly went away when I pasted that in. It's a static method. It's going to take return a type of string. We're going to pass it this string. We're naming ID. And we're going to return the configuration manager.connectionstrings ID.connectionstring. Now I put a note in here that I need to add a reference in our Solution Explorer in references of system configuration. So system configuration is part of the out-of-the-box Visual Studio C#, but it's not included in our project. We just need to add a reference to that. So I'm going to come over to my project again, right-click, choose Add Reference. This is going to be in our assemblies, and I'm going to come down to System Configuration, make sure that's checked, and click OK. And having done that, now our squiggly under configuration manager goes away because it's now part of our project. So what this is going to do is simply going to create our connection string of type ID, which goes back to the CIS262 AD, and that will establish our connection to the database. I'm going to add in 3 more methods here that we're not actually going to use in this project, but typically with a database we want to be able to insert a new record, remove a record, or update a record. And I just want to show you the code for how to do that. That would be done here in the SQLite Data Access class as our helper methods. So here then are our 3 methods. One for save record. We're going to pass it a nominee object, and then we're simply calling our connection again to our SQLite database file. We're going to execute a command to that connection of insert into nominees, passing it the 5 categories and the 5 values from our nominee object. In order to delete a record, we're going to pass it the index of the record we want to delete. And here we're going to execute a statement that is simply delete from nominees, nominees being our table, where ID equals whatever that value is. And then to update the record, we're going to also create our connection and send it an execute command of update nominees, our table. We're going to set year to whatever nom.year is, because we're passing nominee type nom, as well as the IDX, the category of nom.category, the winner of nom.winner, the entity of nom.entity, and we're going to do this where ID equals whatever the index is that we're passing it. So that's how we can save records, delete records, and update records to our SQLite database. In this case, using the fields of our class.